Welcome to Pop.0 with Bryan Chaffin and John Kheit.
Today is Wednesday, December 6th, 2017, and this is a video podcast of the Mac Observer. I'm Bryan Chaffin, editor-in-chief for TMO.
And I'm John Kheit, and I got a cool toy, Bryan.
Look, what's that?
It is a mechanical pencil, an Uni 0.3 millimeter, 0.3. I remember when I was a kid, I thought 0.5 was as far as that technology could possibly go, but this is a 3 millimeter mechanical pencil. I have zero need for mechanical pencils in my life anymore, but it's just so awesome. I had to have it. So check this out. So one, it has this cool X-Acto knife grip, which I really like.
Sure, you need that.
Right. Because you never know, like if you're writing this while, bronco riding a horse, you need that extra grip, right? Because mechanical drafting while bronco riding is an important use case.
Yeah.
So there's a couple of things that are cool with this thing. So one is 0.3 millimeter.
Yeah.
It retracts the lead part like so. So you push this and you have to twist it, and you can see the lead part has come out. I hope
it locks into place. Okay.
And so it's locked, and then you just twist it back out, and it goes back in, and you can see it with the lead already out. So you don't have to worry about unretracting the lead like you do in normal pencils, because as soon as you pop this thing out, it's gone.
Well, no, you're still retracting the lead, but you're retracting the holder with it, which is important because it's so tiny. It's much more fragile.
Yes, but
that's so clever.
It is very clever. And supposedly the shift version of it, as you write, rotates the lead so it doesn't get a sharp flat side.
No, it doesn't.
That's what it's supposed to do. I think that's what it's supposed to do. Anyway, dude, $8.
That's cool.
It's like any geeky person that you know will probably appreciate this, even if they have no use for it, just because it's so over-engineered a thing. Apparently, there's like a cult of mechanical pencils in Japan. I'll share the link in the show notes for the Amazon link for this, but I think it comes over straight from Japan, and it's fantastic. I love this thing, even though I have almost no use for it. And 0.3 millimeter, that's crazy. It's just crazy.
That is pretty darn fine. A buddy of mine was telling me about some fountain pens that Japan makes that are 0.3 millimeter, which is like the finest. And I think an extra fine fountain pen in the States or made in Europe is 0.5, and Japan makes one that's 0.3.
It's kind of cool. This is one of those. It's more an art form at this point than a necessity. It's just incredible. And $8. So like I said, if you've got a geek in your life and you're looking for a good stocking stuffer, this is it. $8.
Did you get in a fight?
I had to. All right, this is a good story. So I'm at we had a late Thanksgiving in my family. Don't ask me why. We had
As you do.
Yeah, it was just the easiest thing with everyone traveling around. So we had it this last weekend, and I go to my place. I have a place in Jersey, and I'm not there very often anymore. But it got cold at night, and my car's tires they deflated just from the coldness, and my car gives a warning. And only bad things happen in my car if the tires aren't perfect. It's a lesson I learned the hard way once, which resulted in ignoring it and thinking it would just go away. I had a blowout going about 120, and my aunt was in the car. And the blowout was so bad that literally almost came off the rim at the time I stopped. It was a miracle it didn't come off completely. And it was just a violent blowout. So learning from that lesson, I'm like, all right, I got to fill these stupid tires. And I have a little tire pressure gauge. Not gauge, filler. It looks like you plug it into the cigarette lighter and you could just fill your tires. You digitally put, actually, that's a good link too. Everyone should have this in their car. And you just fill up your tires. So I have to start my car, which is a tad bit vocal, a car, when I start it, and it runs, because otherwise it can't put enough juice to the cigarette lighter to fill in the air. So I'm out in this open area in the condos that I have in New Jersey, and it's a common area, kind of a courtyard. And I'm filling one tire or another, and that's how I cut my hand. It wasn't a fight. I'd like to say, yeah, it was, brawl at the bars. Took 10 guys on, and barely got out alive. But yeah, I was filling the tires, and I nicked my hand. But then this person comes out, and they're like, "Do you know what time it is now?" It's Saturday at 11 o'clock. And I'm like, well, yes, madam, I do. And she's like, your car is loud. Well, thank you for informing me of that information. She doesn't care that I'm bent over, bleeding. Clearly, my car isn't going anywhere. No. This snowflake needs quiet, and it doesn't matter. It's like, hey, I know you can't move your car. I know you, whatever. That's tough shit. Get a tow truck. Not my problem. People need to be nicer to one another, especially this time. So I was very nice. I didn't say what my real thought in my heart was. Bitch, shut the fuck up. Leave me the fuck alone before I say something nasty to you, which I just kept into my head. But I'm like, is this no concern for anything? Doesn't care. Apparently, I was bent over licking my tires for the fun of it, Brian. That's I like to turn my fucking car on, let it just idle, and lick my tires. That's clearly what I must have been doing. Inconsiderate people, man.
I had, I don't want to derail us too much further, but in the 80s, I wrecked my Vespa about 2 in the morning.
While you were on it?
And what's that?
While you were on it, were you hurt?
Yeah, I was banged up, but not too terribly hurt. And no one came out to assist me or help me or see if I needed a ambulance or anything. And I remember thinking to myself, I bet someone is like peeking around the corner, peeking out their window right now. It was on a residential street, and I bet someone's peeking out their window right now and just going back to bed. And I was working at a Domino's Pizza at the time, and I don't know, 3 or 4 months later, I had someone call up and on that street right there, and I must have mentioned like, oh yeah, I remember wrecking my scooter there once, and dude says, yeah, I remember looking out and seeing you. It's like that's very nice, very nice. Anyway, same kind of thing.
Yeah, well, at this point, my standards are so low. I don't ask for help. I know there's no help coming. I just ask, don't shit on me while I'm down. How about that? How about that? And by the way, it's crazy that people make any noise at 11 o'clock on a Saturday. That's crazy.
That is pretty crazy. That is pretty crazy. Okay, well, we have something else that's crazy.
All right, this is not well, actually, it is the Grumpy Old Man podcast, but let's try to minimize that. And as always, we have several topics, and we're lying. So what are those topics? So today we have the infinite transmission motor, emulators that will help you with your old data, tyranny of the masses versus bloatware. Future Man. Hey. So let's start with this was an article that you did up, Bryan. So it was on this infinite kind of transmission motor. Now let me bring up the video.
Inception Drive. Let me run through the background there. Inception Drive is by someone who's at SRI, Stanford Research Institute. That's the folks that do
that basically brought the GUI to the masses and many, many other things. Actually, all of modern day computing comes from Doug Engelbert at SRI.
Whatever, minor things like that. Plus Siri. Siri came from SRI. That's actually why it's called Siri. And let's see here. So a fellow named Alexander Kernbaum. Stop. Sorry, I didn't have my phone upside down. Alexander Kernbaum came up with something he calls the Inception Drive, and it is essentially a pulley within a pulley for an infinitely variable transmission. And his aim is in robotics. That's where he's talking about it. I love, by the way, I got to tell you, we're gonna show. You show the clip and show the clip. Let's go there.
Yeah, I'm gonna show like a couple of minutes of it because it's worthwhile. He goes through a pretty detailed description, but then we could talk about the ramifications, which I think are very interesting. All right, so hopefully you see my desktop, right?
Yep.
All right, let's. Are you hearing it?
Needs to be louder.
We have the input shaft here and the output shaft there. And as I rotate this collar on the outside, I can shift the gear ratio.
Oh, hold on,
hold on. Velocity is staying the same, but the output will slow down. If I keep on twisting, it'll slow down more, and then eventually actually.
I know the problem here. The problem is that this needs to be in a different browser for you guys to hear it, because
we're gonna make a little sausage.
Yeah, sorry.
So note that this guy, while John is doing this, note that this guy is hanging out.
He's hanging out where?
He's hanging out in a hallway, wearing a plaid shirt with a couple of models in his hand, casually talking about changing the world.
You got to love this. I love there's been a whole bunch of articles like talking about the myth of the individual inventor and stuff like that. I'm like, okay, right. It never happens anymore. Whatevs. Okay, here you go. So here's a bit of his description.
Output shaft there. And as I rotate this collar on the outside, I can shift the gear ratio. So the input velocity is staying the same, but the output just slowed down. If I keep on twisting, it'll slow down more, and then eventually actually do a full reversal. So the first step is to take a look at a conventional continuously variable transmission, which I have a model of right here. And so you have a few key components. You have what you call a V belt, which means if you take a cross-sectional area through the belt, it would be a V shape. Then you have two conical pulleys. And what happens is if you squeeze these pulleys together, the V belt is extruded out to a larger diameter. And so as a result, you can change the ratio between these two. And so the first thing we did was that we rearranged those components, and we fixed one pulley to ground. So this pulley I'm going to keep from rotating. I'll hold it in my hand right here. I'm going to make the input this orbiting motion. I'm going to make this, and this is essentially
it's a rotary engine.
What the input is. What happens is that I've turned this one-to-one ratio into, in fact, it's what we call an infinite ratio, which is where the infinitely variable name comes from. No matter how much I rotate my left hand here, this arrow is always going to point up. If one pulley is slightly larger than the other, it'll cause it to rotate in one direction. And if you switch which one's larger, it'll rotate in the other direction.
Almost organic the way it looks.
But what we finally figured out how to do was that we could place one pulley entirely inside the other one. That's why we call it a nested pulley configuration. And so what we have here is the nested pulley configuration. And so the outer pulley, one of the pulleys, is right here. Here's one half of it, and here's the other half as well right there. Okay. And the inner pulley is right here. Okay, and it's got this big black line on it right there. And what you can see is happening is that the inner pulley is effectively, it's lifting the belt off of the outer pulley from the inside. The really neat thing about this is that you can have the inner pulley or the outer pulley have a larger effective diameter. So even though the inner pulley is physically smaller than the outer pulley, it doesn't stop it from acting like a bigger pulley, essentially. And that allows you to do the full reversal that you can see in the Inception Drive. The very first one we made, we could only change the transmission ratio by twisting a screwdriver, like so. Whereas this one here has a nice, convenient way of changing the ratio where you simply rotate this collar, essentially. And so you can imagine in an actual robotic platform, what you'd have is one primary drive motor and a much, much smaller secondary motor that then controls the transmission ratio. If you can put an infinitely variable transmission in a robot, you can have significant energy savings, especially for cyclic tasks where you're moving back and forth like that. You can also do some really neat tricks where perhaps you have one drive motor and then multiple degrees of freedom that are being coupled through variable transmissions. So we think this transmission can make a big difference for efficiency is key. That might be a walking robot, or it could possibly even just be a mobile robotic base or a platform or something like that. We also think this transmission can make a big impact where human interaction is very important as well, because we think there's an opportunity to make robotic platforms much more safe by adjusting the transmission ratio so that humans can interact with the robot.
So anyway, he is the definition of modest, stating what his applications could be for the.
Thanks, John.
I'll have to edit that. Dang it. All right. Anyway, so yeah, he is the definition of modest in that description, because he I think is being modest in the number of applications this could have. So what would be useful here is to talk about some of the difficulties people have had with electric motor transmissions, like Tesla did originally when it launched the company with its Roadster. When they initially announced it, it was supposed to have a transmission with 2 gears, and the problem there is that electric motors, they rotate at about 14 to 17,000 RPM, and like a high-end sports car will rotate like at 8,500 RPM, like a Ferrari or something like that. So a lot higher. But the interesting thing about an electric motor is the peak torque, the peak power to turn a crank, is at 0 RPM. So what happens is the transmissions that take that torque just get stripped. They get overwhelmed by the power, that peak torque power, immediately from 0, and they get destroyed. And so Tesla could never make that second gear before, and that's why all these electric cars, they kind of top out at 130, 150 miles per hour, because when they're spinning at the peak RPM, whether it's 14 or 17,000 RPM, their power is down. The peak power is kind of early in the spin cycle there. And so it's really rough on a transmission because it just tends to eat and destroy them. And Tesla's solution was, screw it, we'll have 0 transmission. And we'll have a relatively 130 mile per hour, 150 mile per hour lower, speed. And so it's a big problem. And only recently a company called Rimac released a hypercar, an electric hypercar called the Concept 1, which was finally able to go over 200 miles per hour. And they successfully did put a transmission of some sort in on the electric motor, but nobody knows, since it's a $2 million hypercar, how robust is that transmission, how long will it last, because it's just a difficult problem to solve. And apparently Tesla has finally solved the transmission problem with regard to the Roadster that they pre-announced for 2020, because it can go over 250 miles per hour. There's no way an electric motor is going to be able to do that without a transmission. So they probably have a 2 or maybe even a 3-gear transmission on the Roadster. But again, it remains to be seen, because it's been a very difficult problem for a lot of companies that have only recently started to surmount. So how is that relevant for this thing? Well, one, it's not clear, could he use this for a car? Because if he could, there's so many crazy efficiencies by having, this is way better than a CVT in that.
What's a CVT?
It's a continuously variable transmission. And he kind of showed an example of what a CVT looked like with that 2-pulley system. This is even more infinitely variable. And so what it lets you do is, you could think of how does a drone work, right? When you boost up a drone, the propellers are just spinning, pretty much. It's not full power, but it's high power output. But once you get those props going, if you could have a transmission that increases the gearing, all of a sudden the main motor could put out a lot less juice to keep up that same pace. and all of a sudden everything gets more efficient. And so that's part of what he was alluding to with the great efficiencies in robotics, because all of a sudden you could gear things that were never gearable before. You could think about, all right, in a car, you know, like a Tesla, you have a lot of room to make a big bulky transmission, and that's what transmissions are. If you ever look at a transmission, you know, half the engine is engine, and what most people think is still engine is this long, massive, heavy thing onto it, which is a transmission. It's all the gearing that you need for it, and it's a lot of weight. All of a sudden, he puts that in a tiny package. So while it may make sense to have a big bulky transmission in a car, having a transmission in a tiny portable engine was not really feasible in any real way before. And now you could miniaturize what he has with an infinitely variable transmission. It's incredible what it can do for, and I think that's why his focus is initially like robotics and smaller packaging things. But it could also potentially go up to larger things like cars, but it remains to be seen if that kind of diaphragm of gearing that he has around it could stand up to high torques like a car can. So it's, that part's not clear, but who knows, you know, he's thrown out an incredibly compact original idea out in the world, and you know, people can start building on this. But with regard to kind of smaller unit devices, he's done something that was just not doable, which is have transmissions in tiny motor electronics, which is kind of crazy.
Yeah, and it's not just cars. Are you getting an echo? Are you getting an echo from me?
No.
Okay, I'm getting a second. Try to deal with it here. Not just cars, not just robots, fans, hydraulic presses, perhaps. I mean, anything that moves could possibly use this technology. That's why I said he's just casually sitting there standing there in a hall with a shirt that matches the color combination of the carpet, with a couple of hand models, just casually changing the world, talking about changing the world. And what to me, I looked at that and I thought that this could have just huge implications in a wide array of applications.
So again, it remains to be seen what happened on the larger industrial scale, because I think the torque there is so huge that I don't know if that kind of fine, almost filament-like transmission he has could handle large torque. But what he has done definitely on the smaller scale is, I don't know of any single electric motor that has a transmission in it, like, you know, for like a drone or smaller kind of thing, or a fan or anything. Say it's just too complicated to really bother with. And usually so all of a sudden, you know, a fan that took, you know, it could in some ways do for electric motors what LEDs did to incandescent lamps, which is just make them orders of magnitude more efficient.
Yep.
Because you just gear up on the transmission once the thing starts moving, and you need a lot less power to operate them
in a potentially small package.
In a very small package, right? Like I said, it makes sense, and in something as large as an automobile to have this complicated gearing. It makes no sense on a drone or on your fan to have a transmission.
Yeah, but even on a car, if you could reduce. So, all right. So one of the things the automobile industry has been grappling with, at least until possibly the current administration, is ever increasing mileage requirements. And one way to make a car use less gasoline is to make it lighter.
Absolutely.
Right. So if they could take what's a typical in a typical ordinary car, what's a transmission weigh? 100 pounds?
More.
200 pounds?
Yeah, probably.
Right. So, if you could take that same kind of package and make it into something that's, this big instead of this big, and also make it, weigh 20 pounds instead of 200 pounds, you have now just made the car faster and or more fuel efficient.
Yeah, it should perform better because lighter is always better on a car. And I guess unless you're a steamroller. But anyway, I digress. the fear of using absolutes. So it generally makes cards perform better. You know, CVTs perform like poop, quite frankly, from a performance vantage. But yes, from an efficiency vantage, they're better. But it's not clear what kind of torque response this thing will have relative to a CVT. You know, this is early days, obviously. I don't think he even has a prototype.
Right. I mean, we're talking. We're assuming any of these things are even possible. It would be years before we would see anything like that. And of course, it'll depend on who ends up buying this technology or the patents that control it and what they do with it, and a lot of other things. So it has the potential to shift the world a little bit, at least in a number of areas, possibly a lot, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it will.
Yeah. Anyway, it's a super. If you're at all geeky, that's just super stuff. It's super clever, and it's something we don't see a lot of these days. Something that is mechanically new and really innovative. So, yeah, kudos to Mr. Kernbaum.
Kernbaum, yeah. Couldn't you also use this to do infinitely variable just movement? So not just controlling the power, but actually making infinitely fine controls for like how far, for instance, something rotated.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Like, it's kind of over engineering, but then again, we just showed a pencil that has a 0.3 millimeter lead. But yeah, like let you infinitely variable adjust the rate of anything almost.
Yeah, like think about. So I met with a company that's making a 3D printer, a home 3D printer. They're doing a couple of really interesting things. It seems to be a solid 3D printer, and one of the things they're doing is they're not using stepper motors. They're using infinitely variable electric motors. Is that true? Is that correct? Because that's what you were just telling me. Is so they're not the motors themselves aren't infinite.
I don't think they're. I think probably what that just means.
Go ahead.
My guess is that it has like an analog feed to the motor versus a stepped feed. So you instead of having a stepped increase from 5 to 10 rotations per minute or whatever, it's more finely tuned. But that's not a transmission, right?
That's not a transmission. But couldn't something like this be used for ever finer controls like that?
I think so. I think it's just a really powerful construct. It's very trippy. I totally dig it.
Awesome.
It's more, the real question with this is durability for particularly higher torque output, right? And whatever, I'm sure smarter people than us will tackle those problems as it goes on. But it's a very cool really new thing. It's kind of
it's an invention. It's a bona fide invention.
All right. Let's move on to emulators.
By the way, Bitcoin, as we record this, is at 14.3, almost 14.4, $14,400.
It's
almost.
Not a bubble. Totally not a bubble. No way. No way. No way. I know people are spending Bitcoins like left and right. How do you what's funny? I think we talked last week that people, you could go to overstock.com and buy with Bitcoins. Like, do they have to adjust their prices in Bitcoins like per second? Because
no, that's not how it works. It works basically actually, it's kind of how it works. They're not adjusting their price at all. The price is X amount of dollars. You can pay in Bitcoin. So at the moment that you pay, they're using an API that ties into an exchange, and your dollars are actually, I think they're now keeping some of those Bitcoins, but it used to be that you would buy in Bitcoin and it would be instantaneously converted to dollars for Overstock.
I see. Okay.
So that's how all of the places, if you're going to pay for something in Bitcoin online somewhere, that's how they're working. It's determining the price at the moment of the transaction. It's determining the conversion, the
right. So it's a spot price conversion.
It's a spot price conversion. Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense. All right. So I had a problem. This is topic number 2, emulators. I had a problem the other week, which was, believe it or not, in the 1990s, as part of my, actually in 1990, as part of my, I think, junior year engineering project, I did a voice-actuated home automation system with a couple other fellas, one of which that ended up working at X11, I think, which was, for those that do home automation stuff, is a company that was doing this really early on. And it was pretty, so we wrote a paper on the whole thing, and I had the parsing engine working, so kind of like the Siri component of the home automation system is what I made. But I had this document, and I had it in Write Now and in Mac Write, and nothing opens Right Now in Mac Write anymore. I looked all over. There used to be a program like something like Mac Link Plus or something that they stopped making in 2006 that would convert it. And what I do remember is the old Claris converters, were great. But even I think it was AppleWorks. AppleWorks no longer works with macOS. I think it stopped like in 2006 or something. There was a PowerPC version of it, and it was never up. So anyone that has like old Mac Draw, Mac Write, Right Now, kind of these old files that are not uncommon. I bet you a ton of Mac users that have been longtime Mac users have bajillions of these files that are now basically dead on your system. What to do? Some people say, send it to someone with an old running Mac. I guess that's an answer. But I think the real answer is get an emulator. But the problem is the emulators kind of suck. And so the most famous emulator is, here, let me get the Sheep Shaver, I think is, yep, that's what it's called. And when you go to the site, let me blow this up so it's actually, is this viewable at all, Brian?
Yep.
All right. When you go here, like you want to just download something you can install, but there's no like they let you download a zip of the source code, and you're kind of left to try to build this together. And what relationship this has to Basilic 2, I have no idea. It's just it's a shit show. Like there isn't just like download this and run it, which is annoying. And then because of copyright issues, you've got to go hunt down the BIOS from an old PowerPC Mac to make that loadable. And you have to also get like the operating system. It's just a lot of, you've really got to want to do this. And then, I've got a decent technical background, but I could probably, if I was forced to do this, but every time I look at the amount of work you have to do for this, I said, screw it. What did I find? I found this. This is WordPerfect for Mac on Intels, or WPMacApp. And what is awesome about this, and I'm going to give a link to this on the show note, is they give you a disk image, and the disk image is all done. And so when you do this, when you run this, it runs. Now check this out. Talk about blast on the past.
Did you check it for viruses and whatnot?
No, I probably should have, but
before anyone installs this, check it for viruses.
Yeah, it's been out for a while, but good point. But you could see what it's doing is it's launching a full-on Mac, right? They changed the startup screen to say WP Mac appliance, but it's even loading all the extensions. You saw them come up pretty quick.
Yep.
And it the good thing is I also didn't. It wants to install a Spotlight thing that asks for permission, but I just keep telling it no. So nothing installed as root.
Sure.
Not to save you if there's a Trojan in here, but still. So what it loads up is this desktop, and it's the full thing. Like there's all kinds of.
By the way, so we're seeing that it's kind of it's pixelated and low res, but I'm assuming that you're seeing something that looks pretty sharp.
Oh yeah, it's a total. It's just a Mac. It's just a Mac screen here, and you have things like all your control panels after dark, right? So there's a lot of copyright issues, to put it mildly, with this thing. But what it gives you is WordPerfect, so you can run WordPerfect if that's one of, and that comes kind of,
yeah, because there are people out there who have WordPerfect files.
But what's great about this is, WordPerfect works great, and it's all your menus and stuff, and you can open up a document. But what's also great about this is I had an old copy of my Mac Write, And actually, it's not on here. Well, here, this is good. I'll show you exactly how to install it. Look at the screensaver come on. Anyway, this this thing has a directory that you can install to. So let me called here shortcut to OS X, and it defaults to looking in your basically in your documents folder. So what I'm going to do is go to my word processors, and if you happen to have an old copy of like I do of MacWrite, you can install it. So this installs into documents, and I'll just copy this in here. And I'll also copy an old paper. Let me see, academic. Here we go. Where is my old paper here? There it is. Old MacWrite. Yeah, I'll put them both. So you put them into this directory they could see. You could change also the directory. But now when I go in here, I have MacWrite. I'm going to copy it over here. And you'll see, come on, the old MacWrite launches right up.
Sure. And
more importantly, you can then, the Claris version of MacWrite was pretty amazing in that it, where is that? Here we go. Is it documents? Oh. Here we go, Unix and documents. So this is my old paper. Let me open the right now version. That the Claris translators are the greatest translators. They have one like for everything. So it's a fantastic thing to have. And there's also a site that has all this old legacy Mac software on here. And again, you might be concerned for viruses, so check those. But if you're in a pinch and you need this, and the great thing is you can hit print, whatever, and it will print to PDF for you. So now you can, dump these out, or you can, of course, use the Claris exporters to save as and export instead of MacWrite 2 into something like Microsoft Word and get a good conversion of it. Wow, it even has right now for next. No wonder that opened up so well, because these were next documents. But yeah, this is a lifesaver. So you could get your old Mac Draw, Mac Paint. Well, Mac Paint. There's apps that'll do it, but Mac Draw right now and other things. By the way, this is my this is my parser that actually worked. And you know what my parser could do that Siri still can't do?
What's that?
You could teach it a fucking new word. I actually built that into my system to actually teach it a new word.
Why don't you call up Apple? Maybe they need some code.
Yeah, well, gosh, I look at this. I'm like, I can't believe I detailed this down to the register level. Got a good grade for this. But anyway, the more to the point for people that have a lot of these legacy documents, this is like the Wemo stuff that we programmed in. Yeah, but here it is. Here it is. 3 examples. Ready to install a new appliance, and this is where you would teach it a word. See, 1990. This isn't that complicated, people. Anyway, very cool, and it's basically the full-on emulator. It has everything preloaded, so you don't have to go searching like crazy all over the web.
And this is running on an ancient Mac.
This is it's emulating, I think, a PowerPC.
No, your Mac Pro.
Oh no, this is running on my 2016
MacBook Pro.
MacBook Pro.
Oh, okay.
Runs super, like everything runs too fast on it because it's so much more horsepower than was available back then. But it's a full-on Mac emulator. You don't have to muss or fuss with it, and it works out of the box. It has macOS 8.6 on there, which is good enough for all your emulation stuff.
Sure.
So that's one emulator. And yeah, let me shut this down. And let me show you one other one that I got that's really, it's kind of old school geek, but it's a Next emulator and called Previous.
I see what they did there.
Good word.
I see what they did there.
But it is here. So here, let me run this.
And you know, a lot of our watchers and listeners may not know, but you did some time at Next.
Yes, and that's why my fascination for it. And this emulates real Next hardware. It's not because you could always Next release their operating system for Intel, but there were some things that the Next machine could do that the Intel versions couldn't. And there's some software like Lotus Improv, which is still the best, in my opinion, kind of spreadsheet modeler software ever made there. And you could choose kind of, this is a little bit hunt and seek. I'll give people the locations where you can get some of the ROMs and operating systems. But when you set it up, you hit OK. And gosh darn it, if it doesn't start booting a real Next machine with the full ROM, and I've got this doing kind of a detailed boot, which is super geeky, but it even stalls in the exact same places that the Next machine stalled. It's kind of.
Well, but wait, is it, are these just the pictures, or is it actually running the code?
It's running. This is totally running. I mean, it's.
So why wouldn't it install? Why wouldn't it install in the same places?
Well, because the hardware emulation, like that, it has the same stall for, you'll see, it always stalls for the network here. And you used to have to hit Control-C and then C to get through it unless you had a network thing set up. And I'll tell you how old Next were. 10 base T was new technology then. 10, so not 100 base T, which is old by our standards, right? Because it's only 100 megabits. 10 megabits instead of 100 megabits. There was no DHCP back then. Everything was static IP. So that's another reason why this thing halts, right? So it's just crazy that these guys got this working, because there was so much proprietary stuff on the Next machine. And you could tell the boot takes a while.
There's probably like tens of you out there that want this.
Yes, there. Well, I'll
like tens and tens of people.
I'll link to the site. There's actually a really great forum that all this information is on. It's a Next forum, and yeah, there are tens and tens of people. But the people that are on there are pretty, really interesting folks. It's a niche within a niche. But all right, come on, you can boot. It's taking forever just to set the name here. Control. There we go. There we go. Needed a little kick by me. There we are. Yeah, you can imagine what a joy this was to boot off of the Magneto optical drive. Talk about torque, by the way, the Magneto optical drive had so much torque. And remember, the Next cube was a foot cubed magnesium, so it was not exactly a lightweight piece of kit. And you'd have this huge, well, at the time, huge 17-inch megapixel display. And there was enough torque from that Magneto optical drive to shake the desk, because chugging through there. It was crazy. Wow, this is slower than I thought. Come on. Anyway, this is also good if you have, and I do have legacy files kind of with old Lotus Improv stuff, and there's a precursor, believe it or not, to Keynote. Steve Jobs used to use a program called, I think it was Concurrence on Next, which in some ways is still nicer than Keynote. And what's cool about Next, though, is that a lot of the guys that used to make Next apps have free licensed them. So a lot of the best programs on there are free to install. If you look around, they'll give you the licensing keys for free. So it's interesting if you're just a general geeky person that wants to fool around with this old tech. Yeah, so here it goes. We're finally booted into this. And like Digital Librarian, that never made it over. And Digital Librarian is interesting in that it's the precursor to all the indexing and Spotlight stuff. And what happened, it's not on this version, but they used to put the full works of William Shakespeare on here, and it would be indexed and you could find anything you want instantly. But you could also put your own thing, and they'd put their own documentation kind of day in the 90s. But it's a shame they got rid of it, because this whole idea of digital library books and stuff, custom for yourself, was very cool. You kind of have a little part of it in iBooks and a little part of it in Spotlight, but it's not quite the same thing. So a lot of things that were lost. But anyway, I thought those were cool. It was. I'll give you a lot of links to save you the hours of surfing that I had to do to find this stuff. But very cool stuff. And these are emulators you never hear about. So hopefully you, well, you hear about Cheap Shaver, but this pre-built one it was kind of unique, and it was saved hours and hours of time. So I'll leave that for the viewers to explore if they're interested.
That's very cool, man.
All right. And so now it's taking my mouse. Mouse, come back. I hate when emulators do that. There we go. All right. So let us...
we are on to the tyranny of the masses versus bloatware.
Well, so you had a good story about this to start this topic, I think.
Okay, well, I was talking to an unnamed, I won't name him, but an Apple executive, a fairly senior Apple executive.
One.
Well-respected. And his job at the time was to pull out like everything out of OS 10. This was before we shifted over to the name macOS. And so, like, in other words, to find those features that no one uses and pull them out so that OS 10 could be less bloaty. And one of the examples, something that was like hot on my mind at the time, because I personally found it useful, was a keyboard shortcut for dialog boxes. It used to be that if you had a dialog box and you had a, like, don't save, save and cancel, of course you could do the escape key for cancel and Command D for don't save and Command S for save, just for instance. That used to be part at the operating system level. You'll find things like that in Photoshop today because they're hand coded into Photoshop, but it used to be at the operating system level, and Apple pulled it out. And I am very frustrated by that, because Command D is faster than reaching over from the mouse and moving over to the dialog box. Command D for don't save. It is a useful feature. It's a very useful feature. And so I was whining and cranky about that. And he mentioned that, well, we've got the data, no one uses it. So, we pulled it out. And I don't know what their threshold was for no one, because clearly I'm someone, but it's like maybe like me and like somebody in, Timbuktu or something. And it made sense at the time, but then you had a counter where you called that the tyranny of the masses.
Yeah, so it's a stupid shitwad example of reasoning, and if design is at all governed by this, it's pathetic. The masses of anything suck. The mass of drivers suck. The mass of just take any activity, the bulk of humanity generally sucks at it, and that should not be the guiding principle for what great design is. And by that same argument, we don't need a Mac Pro, because almost nobody buys a Mac Pro compared to all the other Macs. And you know what? We shouldn't have Macs at all, because almost nobody buys Macs compared to iPhones. If you start taking this edict, all of a sudden nothing but mediocrity will be left, because that's what mediocrity is about, right? It's what the bulk of people do in the bulk of the way, which is always just shitty. And it can't be a design principle. Further, there's a difference between bloatware and how do we call it? Bloatware is bad design, but removing features because you're too stupid to figure out a nice way to have depth to your program that's not confusing is also a cop-out. Meaning, if you design your user interface where it has deep features that stay out of the way, except for those that need to use them when they need to use them, that's not bloatware. That's just good design. So,
but yeah, I would say though, John, that there's a somewhere there's a good point. There's a point where you have bloatware, to it, many Microsoft products, especially in the 90s and 2000s. Right? There's a point where you have bloatware, and then there's a point where you have stuff that's you know, so minimalistic and optimized that, you know, it's useless. And somewhere in the middle, there's a good place to be.
I used to think the same, but my opinion evolved on this. And I heard a really great interview with Douglas Engelbart, who we just mentioned him. He is credited for the creation of the mouse and basically modern day GUI at SRI, deservedly so.
Networking.
Incredible dynamic programming principles, just incredible stuff. If you just search mother of all demos, his 1968 demo comes up. But this was a much later interview, and he had a frustration with kind of Steve Jobs making everything simple. And his theory was, my task was not to make everything simple and dumb. My task was to augment your abilities to be greater than they ever could be just as a natural human being. And that means there is going to be complexity. I'm going to help you manage that complexity, but we shouldn't shy away from complexity. And there's a lot of truth to what he says. And I'll tell you what the problem with the bloatware was in the time era that you're talking about, kind of like I think the Word 5 and Word 6 era, right, was kind of the famous era for Microsoft Word bloat, which was, it's a question of recipe. Yeah, if you talk to anyone that uses AutoCAD, they're not going to say it's bloated. It's a ginormous program with a lot of depth, but it needs to be there if you're a CAD person, right? You can't say, oh, well, this interconnection to the CAM accessories that we use that lets us actually, you know, put out what we draft into the real world. Yes, it's complex, but it's not that it's bloat. We need it if we're ever going to make it real. And so it's a function of design. Back then, the design was just lop it on, just lop on another thing without any thought. And to this day, if you look at Acrobat's a great example of bloatware design, where the menus are almost randomly populated. The features have no coherence. To find a feature, it's hunt and go seek. It's probably in there somewhere, but Lord knows there's no logical way to get there. And so to me, it's a question of recipe. It's kind of like, why didn't the Trio take off and other things before the iPhone that were kind of iPhone-ish like? Because the recipe wasn't a right balance. The fact that the iPhone can do anything now, I mean, it makes the old Star Trek episodes where I used to laugh that like that tricorder can do anything, right? What a joke. And I used to think it was unrealistic. But the iPhone is a very simple construct that lets you have a simple mechanism to find extra complexity. Meaning, if you need an app that tape measures your room, you can find that and use it. And the device is still a simple device that's powerful and is extendable with greater and greater depth because they found a good mechanism for adding that complexity and depth. There's no reason that apps can't do the same thing when they're well designed, where most of the easy interfaces there are available for the average person that doesn't need to get in depth. But for the person that needs, I don't know, line numbers in their Word document or whatever, or a table of contents, that depth unfurls itself in a more natural and reasonable way to discover things there. These are not, in my opinion, they're not mutually exclusive. It's not a, we have to limit the features. It's a, you have to find a good recipe for the interface to make the depth reasonable to access and not obtrusive to the average use. This is a doable thing, and I think it's a cop-out when people say it's one or the other. that just says, I'm a shitty designer and I can't figure out how to do it. And again, the iPhone, I think, is the perfect example of infinite depth when you need it.
My whole point is that there is somewhere there is an optimal line. And I don't know where exactly that optimal line is. I think that Apple has strayed too far towards the simple. But I do think that there is a point where things become bloaty.
Well, I think we both agree on that part, meaning you know a bloated bad design when you see it. My point is that the addition of all the features that we're kind of, I think, mislabeling as the problem of bloat, it's not that the features are bloaty, it's that the implementation of how you use them and get to them is bad.
Okay, well, so then where would you put something like Command D? Because obviously, Command D for close. I mean, it's not you know, that just shouldn't have been pulled out.
It's totally not bloat. It's one of those things that the average user won't even notice is there, so it doesn't bother them, right? It doesn't get in their way, and for the user that knows it's there, it helps them. So it's a total shitty. I mean, it's just bad decision making then. As far as I'm concerned. And again, you can't say that just because most users don't use this, we're going to pull it out. Again, you're putting in features that, what would the greatest user that we ever had like to have? If we had the best if Jesus was our user, what would Jesus like to have in there? And the fact that all of us can't live up to the Jesus standard is okay, right? We all fall short of Jesus. But if there was a Jesus user, what would Jesus use? And Jesus would use Command D, because Jesus don't got time to be messing around with all that other noise. He's got to get shit done. There's a lot of prayers to answer and all this stuff. He needs to be efficient. So that can't be the standard, because when you start reducing that standard to its kind of absurd conclusion, it's like, well, I said it just before, but you know what? We don't need a Mac Pro, because almost nobody has Mac Pros. And then while we're at it, we don't need any Macs at all, because by comparison, almost nobody uses Macs compared to iPhones and iPads and stuff. And it just starts, all you do is you make mediocrity.
Yeah, it's the tyranny of the masses.
Yeah. And it's a bad cop-out that sounds like it's data-driven. You know what? Apple, right? I don't know if Apple mocks them, but I mock them. It's like the Google's all about the data, all about the data-driven stuff. And Apple's supposed to be more about the artistic and the aspirational. Although with the week that it's had last week, it's kind of a joke in comparison. But that should be the goal. Even if you fail at getting to it, it should be the goal. And the point is to make great design. So I think it's a weak argument, and all you get as a result of that is mediocrity. So, okay, so think about it. I always found this amazing. It's like when you say, you know, what the average user is, that's not even a C student at that point. That's the 50th percentile, right? So these are failures by academic standards of what the average user is dictating. That's a very low bar to go to that median or to that part of the bell curve. You can't have a user interface that solely is dictated by the lameness of that middle. Now, it makes sense to make something really accessible, so maybe the first layer of presentation or the most common features are in that way. But software needs to have depth and layers, and things, as you grow, it should be able to accommodate a reasonable part of the bell curve. I mean, you can't get all the way out, but you got to go out to some degree, especially for professional users too. And this platform in its past has always, targeted professional users, and they're not at the median level of the bell curve. They may be for one app, but not for another. But if you know what I mean? So like maybe you're an audio person, but could you imagine that if you're an audio person, you need a lot of bells and whistles on your audio software, but you could just say, well, our 50th percentile doesn't use 90% of these features, so we're going to get rid of them. And you're going to, but that's crazy. you just end up killing all the software, kind of through divide and conquer that way. Because yeah, the audio person doesn't care that his word processor doesn't have, a paragraph numbering or table of contents, because he or she never deals with that. But he needs depth in his app, and vice versa. The writer needs depth in his app and maybe doesn't care about the audio program. But what that tells you is you shouldn't be reducing feature sets all along the line. You should be enriching them, but finding a natural way to make the mean features, the average features, easily attainable and accessible by most people, but for the depth to be there in a natural way for those that need it too. That should be the design goal. The design goal shouldn't be just to simplify everything into the point where it's just a tinker toy. And that's where I think Douglas Engelbart was actually right in his criticism, that his job is not to simplify everything. I mean, if it can be made more simple, that's great. But his job is to give you access to more and more, for the ability to master more and more complexity in a way that you couldn't otherwise have done. So maybe you're right. I mean, maybe the best that developers can do is find some kind of middle line, but I don't agree. I think, again, the iPhone is a perfect example. It's a device that's bone dead simple, realistically, for its kind of average functions. But anyone that has a specialty that they want to get into can greatly enhance the depth of what this device can do. And they devise the user interface to let people do that. And there's no reason why that's not doable elsewhere. It just takes people some thought to lay things out better, frankly. I think it's that remedial in most cases. Is just put the common features up front and then have, the more complex features available in secondary, tertiary menus or whatnot. Anyway, I think it's a bad excuse for having low expectation.
Radio.
All right, Future Man. I finally finished watching the series. Spoilers, spoiler warning if you haven't seen it yet, and you're still listening this far, you might want to pull the eject if you want to keep it fresh, and you should, because it's a delightful show to enjoy without anyone ruining it for you. I didn't fully understand what you said when you in your comments when you said like they should end it right where it was, but I do now. It was an artistic ending in that if they made not even one more episode, it's great. It just ends kind of with a potential infinite possibilities that your imagination should enjoy. The show is silly and stupid and juvenile on many levels, but really bright and funny in other levels. And again, for those that haven't,
it's gross, it's hilarious, it's brilliant, it's
it blatantly ripped off.
It's over the top and it's subtle.
And it blatantly rips off many other TV shows and movies of the past that it freely cops to.
Yeah, that are freely cops to. That's the thing. Is like they ever. I mean, the characters within the show point out when the storyline is borrowing from other storylines.
And the high end version premise of the show is, again, it's a kid that plays a video game and is the only person to ever beat it, and then people from the future come back to help him save the universe.
Yeah, the video game was actually a training simulator that was sent back from the future to find the hero that could help them beat the bad guys.
Right, which is a ripoff of The Last Starfighter, which they've really copped to.
Yes.
And but then it takes weird turns from there. What was interesting about it, it was very smart. Well, not very smart, but considering the how schlocky the show is, it was decently smart about time travel and its effects.
Yeah.
And and that there are consequences for all these actions. And it was I don't know, it's just a funny, stupid show. I think it's a guy's show. I don't think it's like a lot of I could be wrong, but Jenny kind of was good for the first half of it and kind of got burned out with the juvenile humor.
Yeah, fair enough. I'd love to hear from ladies and men out there who watched it. But this is a Hulu original, by the way, so you can only get it by subscribing to Hulu Live.
But yeah, it ended in a way, the ending where you know, at the end he's sitting in jail because he kind of took the rap for a lot of the bad things that are going down, and then you see right before the end of the show, like a little time travel. Jenny says that she appreciates the show enough to have watched all of it. But you see the flutter of the time travel lights, so you know, and if there's going to be one, it's kind of foreshadowed in that. But even if they ended just like that, it was kind of, I don't know. There was some kind of good storytelling symmetry to the way they ended it, and it was just satisfying to me.
Did you again, spoilers? The chef tangent was weird and yet funny.
It was awesome. It was awesome.
It was weird and yet hilariously funny. It was quite I love that character.
He was fantastic. And what's funny is when the show starts, I forget his name, but he's like a male soldier grunt, and yeah. I thought his whole role was just going to be this male soldier grunt.
Yeah, thing. He's the guy that reached around someone's neck and said "reach around" as he called his own death blow. Like you do. You call your death blows. School trophy. Especially when it's reach around. Especially when it's reach around. Yeah. With no, and I've said this before. It might have been on another show. Might have been on the show. I said before that what I love is that they don't take the time to point it out. They just do it, and they let the joke sit there for people to notice or not.
Yeah, it's great. No laughing.
Yeah, and they don't like the other characters don't ever go, why do you always call out your death blows? I mean, it just happens, and it's just like this game show brought to life, and game show, a video game brought to life. Just brilliant stuff, man. Good stuff. I binged it over like 2 days.
As did I. I binged the first half with Jenny, and Jenny wasn't up for the second half, so that was fine. But I loved it. It was super well done. If you like silly juvenile humor, you're gonna have a good time with this show.
Yeah, but it's not just juvenile humor. I think there's a lot of very smart stuff going on.
Yes, it's a mix of, well, it's kind of like, in some sense, if you're the type of person that likes Family Guy and South Park, there's a lot of stupidity and a lot of intelligence wrapped up into one coherent whole.
Right.
So I find it kind of in that genre of humor. But your mileage may vary. Anyway, I think
that's it, man.
I think we were very efficient today.
Yeah. Well, I don't know about that.
Only 3 or 4 tangents instead of 7 or 8. Well, thank you, Brian. I appreciate the talk as always.
Yeah, likewise. Likewise. Thanks for everybody that joined us, and appreciate the comments. And we'll see you next week, right?
And on that popular set of topics, we'll see you next week.